Francis Drake. The name echoes like a legend, a national hero, a knight, a conqueror of the seas. But let us cast aside the polished myths. Behind this grand facade lies something far darker, shockingly paradoxical. A man whom today we would unhesitatingly call a war criminal, a pirate, a slave trader. Yes, the very Drake whose exploits are lauded in textbooks began his journey on the decks of ships transporting human cargo. His hands were stained not only with the blood of the crown's enemies, but also with the shame of an inhumane trade. How could one person embody such contradictory essences? A national hero and a ruthless predator? This dissonance is no accident, but a sinister imprint of his developing personality. At the core of every monster, or every hero who carries the shadow of a monster, lies a fractured childhood. Francis Drake was no exception. We have already touched upon his early life, but to understand the essence of this man, his ruthlessness, his paradoxical belief in his own righteousness, one must delve into the darkest corners of his formative years. His cradle was the creaking deckboards, and his nursemaid the salty wind and the roar of the waves. Born in Devon, his true birth as an individual occurred on those flimsy vessels, where every breath was permeated with the scent of tar, salt, and human sweat. Poverty was not just a backdrop. It was the air he breathed, forging in him an iron will to survive, to rise from that abyss, to exact absolute, uncompromising retribution for every missed opportunity, for every humiliated soul. His father, Edmund Drake, a former farmer, impoverished and forced to flee Catholic persecution, became a Puritan preacher. This was more than just a biographical detail. It was a seed sown in fertile ground. Imagine, a child whose existence was constantly threatened, whose family lived in perpetual fear, absorbing not just faith, but a fervent, almost hysterical fanaticism. For him, the world was divided into black and white, into righteous and sinners, into those with God and those against him. And against God for a Puritan of that era often meant Catholic, Spaniard, Papist. In this theological paradigm, colored by personal grievance and fear, his worldview was shaped, uncompromising, irreconcilable, where the enemy was not merely an opponent, but the embodiment of evil, destined for destruction. In this world, where survival was the highest virtue and morality a luxury, John Hawkins emerged, a cousin, mentor, and, in essence, a second father. Hawkins was more than just a sailor. He was an architect of a new, brutal reality at sea, where slavery was merely one tool for enrichment. He taught Francis not only navigation, the art of combat, and survival in storms, but also far more insidious lessons: how to turn human lives into coin, how to exploit others' suffering for personal gain, how to see people merely as resources. Drake, absorbing these lessons, transformed from a frightened child into a predator. Hawkins was his university, and the ocean his classroom. Where every storm, every transaction, every skirmish was a lesson, burning new scars onto his soul and hardening his will. But there was one point, one festering wound, that finally forged Drake from malleable metal into steel, tempered by hatred and a thirst for revenge. San Juan de Ulúa, 1568. This was not merely a battle. It was a treacherous betrayal, seared onto his soul like a fiery brand. English ships, including Drake's, Judith, and Hawkins' Minion, found themselves trapped in the Spanish harbor of Veracruz. The Spanish viceroy, Martín Enríquez de Almanza, offered a truce, solemnly promising safety. But the oath proved a lie, woven from treachery and Catholic cunning, as Drake perceived it. The Spanish attacked suddenly, without warning, leaving no chance. Drake watched as his comrades perished in flames, as their ships sank, as hope turned to dust. He lost everything: ships, cargo, many friends. But most importantly, he lost faith. Faith in justice, in honor, in any semblance of humanity from the enemy. In that moment, in that hell, something broke within him. Or conversely, something was born. A cold, all-consuming hatred for Spain. This was not just anger, it was an oath. An oath to avenge, to plunder, to destroy, without mercy. He was no longer a boy seeking sustenance. He became a weapon, forged in the fires of betrayal, an instrument of retribution. His soul, if it had ever been pure, was now scorched by this flame, blackened and hardened like a crust of lava. And with this mark on his soul, with this new, ruthless view of the world, Francis Drake began his path. A path where every step was a meticulously planned act of vengeance, where every decision was dictated not only by a lust for gold, but also by a deeply ingrained desire to crush those who had once dared to betray him. After the massacre at San Juan de Ulúa, when the blood of English sailors stained the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, Francis Drake returned home not merely as a ruined captain. He was a man possessed, his fury cold and calculating. It simmered in the shadows, preparing for a grandiose act of retribution that would turn the world upside down. But this required more than just a thirst for revenge. It demanded money, plausible deniability, and a complete disregard for moral principles. And Drake, as it turned out, was a master of this dark alchemy. He embarked on his most audacious project, one that would go down in history as the circumnavigation on the Golden Hind, but it began as a meticulously planned deception. Common folk, and even many influential shareholders, believed they were investing in an ordinary trading expedition to the shores of Egypt, or at worst, in the search for the mythical Terra Australis Incognita, the great southern continent. To Queen Elizabeth Thurs, who, as we now know, was not only aware but a key, albeit hidden, investor, Drake sold the idea of a punitive expedition against Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. None of them, neither the naive merchants, nor even most of the crew, suspected the grand, deadly, dangerous plan to penetrate the Pacific Ocean, the Spanish crown's private lake, and plunder it to its depths. This was a game of fire, where not only riches were at stake, but also the fragile peace between England and Spain. Every step, every word of Drake's was part of a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to divert attention from his true intentions. The ships were prepared in the deepest secrecy, under the cover of night, and the cargo intended for trade was, in essence, a set of tools for large-scale piracy. This was more than just stock fraud. It was state-sponsored piracy wrapped in the guise of noble exploration and retribution. And the grander the lie, the easier it was believed. But any meticulously constructed pyramid of lies demands absolute control. And Drake established this control in the most brutal and uncompromising manner. When the flotilla reached the somber shores of Patagonia, the infamous Port St. Julian, a place where Magellan himself had once quelled a mutiny, the time for reckoning arrived for Thomas Doughty. Doughty, a gentleman, former secretary to the powerful Sir Christopher Hatton, and a key investor, was more than just a companion. He was a potential threat. He knew too much, saw too much. His ambitions, his doubts, his possible unwillingness to participate in an openly piratical venture, all made him dangerous. Drake staged a show trial, a farce under the scorching sun of a foreign land. Accusations poured forth: mutiny, witchcraft, treason. This was not a search for truth, but the elimination of an obstacle. No one dared object when Drake, like an ancient tyrant, pronounced the sentence. Doughty was beheaded. His blood, soaking the foreign soil, became a silent testament to Drake's absolute power. This was not merely an act of justice. It was a ritual of intimidation. Every crew member, every officer, looking at Doughty's bloodied corpse, understood. Drake would stop at nothing. He was prepared to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goal. This episode reveals Drake's true, merciless nature. A man who not only broke rules but rewrote them with his own blood, ensuring no one dared stand in his way. And this display of force, this ruthlessness, became the guarantee of his future successes. When the Golden Hind slipped into the Pacific Ocean, it was a bolt from the blue for the Spanish. Their lake, the vast waters they considered their inviolable domain, was suddenly breached. Drake didn't just arrive. He came to plunder. And he plundered with unprecedented audacity and efficiency. Spanish ports, unaccustomed to threats from the sea, fell one after another. Valparaiso was devastated. In Callao he found dozens of treasure-laden ships awaiting departure, and although most of the fleet had left, Drake still managed to seize incredible spoils. But all this was merely a prelude to the main act of his bloody ballet. The true prize awaited him on the open sea. It was the galleon, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, or, as it was nicknamed, the Cacafuego, Shitfire, or Spitfire. This vessel was not just a ship, it was a floating warehouse of riches, collecting silver and gold ingots, precious stones, and spices from all corners of the Spanish dominions. Drake pursued it for several days, employing all his skill as a navigator and tactician. And when the Cacafuego was finally overtaken, the sight was incredible. The ship's holds groaned with treasure. Hundreds of kilograms of gold, tons of silver, emeralds, pearls, wealth beyond imagination. The crew of the Golden Hind worked for days on end, transferring this untold cargo. The silver ingots were so heavy they nearly broke through the Hind's deck. Gold, like sand, poured from the chests. This was plunder on an unprecedented scale. Drake didn't just capture a Spanish ship. He tore a piece from the very heart of the Spanish Empire, demonstrating to the world that its power at sea was not so absolute. This was not merely revenge. It was a triumph of greed, audacity, and cold calculation. He returned to England not just as a hero, but as the richest pirate in history, and his sponsors, including the Queen herself, reaped fabulous profits. But behind this dazzling golden dust lay shadows. The shadows of those who stood behind Drake, and those who fell victim to his ambitions. The Golden Hind, laden with riches beyond the wildest dreams, was not merely the vessel of a lone pirate. It was the spearhead forged in the darkest cabinets of English power, an instrument whose existence hung by the thinnest thread of state secrecy. Behind Francis Drake stood not merely Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose image we are accustomed to seeing in formal portraits, but a calculating, cynical strategist whose desire to weaken Spain and fill the treasury was boundless. She did not just invest. She was the architect, the inspirer, the main beneficiary of this audacious, criminal adventure, which was essentially an act of state terrorism. But Elizabeth was not alone. Behind every pound sterling invested in equipping the Golden Hind lay the shadow of a powerful aristocrat, a greedy merchant, or a courtier eager to multiply their fortune at Spain's expense. This was not just venture capital. It was a syndicate, a secret society, where every shareholder risked not only money, but their head if their involvement were revealed. Dukes and earls, privy council members, London bankers, all were part of this predatory coalition, whose threads stretched to the very heart of the English establishment. Their motives were as varied as they were corrupt, from religious fanaticism and hatred for Catholic Spain to a pure, undisguised lust for profit and power. Drake was their hammer, their blade, their ruthless executor, whose cruelty and efficiency ensured that investments paid off handsomely. In this theater of shadows, there were also victims, pawns ruthlessly sacrificed. Recall Thomas Doughty. His execution at Port St. Julian was not merely an act of quelling a mutiny. It was a ritualistic, exemplary act of intimidation, a signal to anyone who dared question Drake's absolute authority or, more importantly, reveal the true nature of this expedition and its high-ranking patrons. Doughty was not merely a traitor. He was a man who knew too much, who could shatter the carefully constructed legend, jeopardizing not only the mission, but also the reputations and lives of those who stood in the shadow of the throne. His death became a bloody warning. In this game, there was no room for weakness, no room for doubt, no room for leaks. Across the ocean, in the sun-drenched colonies, a completely different drama unfolded, a drama of helplessness and ignorance. Spanish viceroys, such as Francisco de Toledo in Peru, were rulers of vast but unwieldy empires, whose orders took months to travel, and news of the enemy arrived too late. They were trapped in a bureaucratic web. Their fleets were dispersed, their garrisons weak. For Drake, these colonial officials were merely shadows, obstacles that could be bypassed or crushed with a single blow. Their helpless dispatches, full of panic and despair, only underscored his elusiveness and audacity. He was a ghost who materialized from the Morpai, plundered, and vanished, leaving behind only chaos and devastation. And above all this loomed the figure of Philip II, the Spider King, whose empire stretched across the world, but whose patience was not limitless. For him, Drake was not just a pirate, but a personal insult, a heretic, and a brigand who had encroached upon Spain's God-given right to own the New World. Every captured galleon, every burned port was a blow to his prestige, to his infallibility, to his Catholic faith. Philip was ruthless, but his empire was too vast to react quickly. He was like a giant slowly awakening. His anger accumulated, becoming ever more palpable, ever more threatening. The Spanish Empire, this colossus with feet of clay, would ultimately have to respond. And when it did, its response was devastating, changing the course of history. But that was another story entirely, a story of how even the most invincible heroes can find themselves on the brink when retribution arrives. The roar of triumph following the defeat of the Armada slowly, inexorably, began to fade, replaced by the grating whisper of disillusionment. Sir Francis Drake, the Dragon of England, the man who had defied empires and plundered the world, found the golden sheen of his legend tarnished. He was no longer the swift, unpredictable predator, gliding unseen through the shadows. The very system he had so deftly exploited now demanded a more conventional, more cumbersome form of warfare, ill-suited to his mercurial genius. The Cadiz raid, audacious and destructive, was perhaps his last true flourish of the old brilliance. But what followed was a stark, brutal descent. The Grand Portuguese Expedition of 1589, a joint Anglo-Dutch venture aimed at seizing Lisbon and installing a pretender to the throne, was a colossal, humiliating failure. Thousands of English soldiers, many of them press-ganged, perished not by Spanish steel, but by disease and starvation. Drake, commanding the fleet, made critical errors, misjudged defenses, and squandered resources. The expedition, meant to deal a death blow to Spain, instead bled England dry and cost Queen Elizabeth a fortune and, more importantly, a significant chunk of her trust in her former favorite. His star, once blazing, began to dim. The court whispered. The public, who had once hailed him as a demigod, now saw the cracks in the idol. The ruthless pragmatist, the man who had executed Doughty to maintain control, now struggled to command loyalty and discipline on a massive, unwieldy scale. He was a master of the surgical strike, not the protracted siege. For years, Drake found himself in a purgatory of semi-retirement, his influence waning, his ambition chafing under the enforced idleness. But the lure of one last grand enterprise proved irresistible, a desperate gamble to reclaim the glory that had slipped through his fingers. In 1595, he embarked on his final voyage to the West Indies, a joint command with his old mentor, John Hawkins. It was meant to be a triumphant return to his hunting grounds, a final devastating blow against the Spanish Main. Instead, it became a slow, agonizing march towards oblivion. The Caribbean, once a playground for his audacious raids, had transformed. Spanish defenses were stronger, their garrisons alert, their ships better prepared. The element of surprise, Drake's most potent weapon, was gone. Every engagement was a brutal grind, every victory Pyrrhic. The sun-drenched islands, once rich with plunder, now seemed to exhale pestilence. The true enemy was not the Spanish tercios, but the unseen, insidious killer that stalked the decks, dysentery. It ravaged the crews, weakening men faster than any cannonball. John Hawkins, the man who had first introduced Drake to the brutal realities of the sea and the slave trade, succumbed to the disease on Christmas Day 1595, a grim harbinger of what was to come. Drake, perhaps driven by a desperate, almost manic desire to prove himself, pressed on. But his body, too, was failing. Decades of relentless voyages, of salt-soaked nights and sun-baked days, of scurvy and privation, had taken their toll. The iron constitution of the young pirate had been eroded. The man who had survived storms, battles, and the wrath of an empire found himself helpless against the microscopic invaders. He fell ill, racked by fever and agonizing pain. His mind, once so sharp and cunning, likely clouded by delirium, perhaps replaying the vivid scenes of his violent past, the screams of the dying, the glint of stolen gold. On January 28, 1596, off the coast of Portobello, the legendary Sir Francis Drake, the scourge of God to the Spanish, the dragon to the English, breathed his last. He died not in the glory of battle, not by the sword of a Spanish foe, but in the squalor of his cabin, defeated by a common intestinal infection. His body, encased in a lead coffin, was committed to the very waters he had so ruthlessly dominated, a solitary burial at sea, far from the grand tombs of English heroes. No fanfare, no cheering crowds, only the mournful splash as he sank into the depths. It was an ignominious end for a man who had lived such a bombastic life, a final, inescapable reckoning delivered not by man, but by the very natural world he had sought to conquer. Was it a poetic justice? the ultimate price for a life built on violence, exploitation, and the cold calculation of human suffering. His demise forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of his legacy, to peel back the layers of heroism and examine the dark, festering core beneath. The final act of his life, a slow, painful surrender to an invisible enemy, reveals something profound about the true nature of power, ambition, and the inescapable consequences that eventually catch up to even the most formidable figures. Francis Drake's lead coffin, resting at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, holds not only the dust of a man, but also unresolved questions that echo through the centuries. What can we glean from this story, steeped in blood, gold, and betrayal? What uncomfortable truths are hidden behind the gleam of knightly armor and the thunder of victories? Drake's primary lesson is one of the cynical pragmatism of power. He was not merely a pirate, but a state asset, an instrument of geopolitical warfare disguised as private plunder. His heroism was a function created to justify England's unprincipled expansion. Queen Elizabeth I did not simply allow him to act. She invested in his crimes, transforming him into a kind of state terrorist, long before that term came into vogue. What was a triumph and a source of wealth for England was, for Spain, an act of egregious, unprovoked piracy and state banditry. And both sides were convinced of their righteousness, relying on their own convenient morality. This duality, this disconnect between the official narrative and the bloody reality, is the first and most painful parallel with modernity. Do we not see today how states use proxy forces, private military companies, or even hacker groups to achieve their goals, while denying direct involvement? Do economic sanctions not exist, which are essentially a modern form of siege and devastation, yet sanctioned by international law? Do heroes not emerge whose exploits are, in reality, acts of aggression or violations of sovereignty, but are justified by national interests or the defense of values? Drake was a master of the hybrid warfare of his time, where the line between crime and state policy blurred beyond recognition. Drake's life also poses the eternal question about the nature of heroism. Can a man who actively participated in the slave trade, ruthlessly plundered and killed, be a true hero? Or is heroism merely a label assigned to victors, whose history is then written at the dictation of those who remained in power? Drake was brave, fearless, and incredibly lucky. This is undeniable. But his bravery was often directed at destruction, his luck at enriching himself at others' expense. His greatness rests on a foundation of others' suffering and loss. This reminds us that the history we study in schools is often a filtered, sanitized version of events, where dark spots are either suppressed or justified by the spirit of the times. But the spirit of the times does not nullify universal principles of humanity. The price of the greatness embodied by Drake proved colossal. For England, it was a surge of power, a golden age, but also the beginning of an imperial path fraught with colonialism and exploitation. For Drake himself, it was a life full of dangers, paranoia, recall Doughty's execution, and ultimately, neglect and disillusionment in his final years. He died not in glory, but from illness, far from home, on an expedition that proved a fatal failure. His end was not a heroic death in battle, but a dismal fading, symbolizing how quickly the wheel of fortune can turn against those who cling too long to past victories. Drake's story is not just a collection of facts and dates. It is a deep psychological study of a man shaped by poverty, religious fanaticism, and a thirst for revenge, who became the perfect instrument for an ambitious queen. It is a story of how personal traumas can be transformed into national policy and a lust for gain into a crusade. And it is, finally, a warning that heroes can be created by propaganda, and their true nature often remains hidden beneath layers of myth. We look at Francis Drake and see in him a reflection of our own contradictions: humanity's capacity for incredible feats and for horrifying cruelty, society's willingness to turn a blind eye to crimes for profit, and the eternal pursuit of power that continues to shape the world around us, sometimes under the most noble masks. His shadow, undoubtedly, extends far beyond the horizon of his era, influencing how we perceive conflicts, economic dominance, and the very essence of what it means to be a great power. But this is only part of the picture, for no story exists in a vacuum. There are always hidden threads leading to those who pulled them, to those who remained in the shadows, but whose influence was no less, and sometimes even more, significant.